prompts that I think people need. So
Hello? Yep, okay, great. Hey everyone, welcome. Welcome to Fluke Hall. We are one of the 3 CoMotion lab spaces. We specialize in life science and biotech. The other 2 spaces are CoMotion HQ with Suni, the managing director back there. They are in emerging tech, AR, VR, and Startup Hall, which is software IT. It's managed by Ashley, who's in the line. Yep, right there. So if you have any questions about CoMotion Labs, find one of us. Oh, Makerspace with Chu, right there. She's also open for questions, so feel free to berate her after this. Yeah, welcome to Fundamentals for Startups Fridays. Just as a reminder, all Fundamental for Startups presentations are live streamed on our YouTube page. Past talks are also available there. Just look out for the playlist Fundamentals for Startups. Next week, we have Shauna Casey from Madrona Venture Labs, and she will be discussing Startup Studio Model, building a startup in 6 months. For the full schedule and more information on other events, visit our CoMotion events page. And on Wednesday next week, we actually have CoMotion Labs monthly public tours starting at 1 p.m. at CoMotion HQ. If you're ever curious to see what the facilities look like and what we do with the companies, you're welcome to swing by. You can visit HQ, Startup Hall, Fluke Hall, and Makerspace. Okay, let me present today's speaker, Magli Eden, talking about creating product market fit through discovery. Magli is CoMotion's Assistant Director of Innovation Training, an intellectual property lawyer and faculty member at the University of Washington Law School. Before joining the university, she practiced law in 2 major international firms in France and Seattle. She managed intellectual property portfolios and transactions for clients in a wide breadth of industries, including retail, manufacturing, wine, publishing, luxury goods, and gaming. She's a member of the New York Bar, and she also holds a master's degree in international law from a university in France. If you want to know the name of that, I'd ask her after this. She will pronounce it correctly. And she also holds an LLM from the University of Washington, where she originally attended as a recipient of the prestigious Fulbright Scholarship. So, introducing Magli.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to see you all. Well, actually, it's great. This was a great introduction that told everything except what I might have to do with startups. For my background as to building things and why I'm talking about product market fit, I did build a nonprofit when I was in France as a lawyer, aside from what I did. And what I do today is I actually build programs for CoMotion. So I do a fair amount of discovery on my own, and hopefully what I share with you will be useful for you. Now, before I start, I'm actually super curious to know who is here because you're a member of a startup. A bunch of you. How about who is here because you have an idea and you'd love to start something? All right. And who's here just because you're curious and you just want to learn more? Awesome. Cool. So we have a little bit of everything. So hopefully I'll be able to address kind of a little bit of everything. Let's start from the start. What are we going to cover today? We're going to look at why this is important, why discovery is important, and kind of what this is. For those of you who might not know. We're going to look at some frameworks and tools for discovery, and we're going to look at how you could build your discovery skills, kind of a few skills that we can look at. What we're not going to talk about is industry-specific stuff, because that is something that ultimately discovery is very industry-specific, and so it's about each person in each industry to find their route and to find exactly what to do and where to put the focus. And another thing we won't do is go specifically into B2B or B2C types of ventures, because again, there are some strategies. We'll point out certain things that are specific, but apart from that, we'll kind of stay general, and you guys can drill in probably on your own. So why this is important? That is the number one statistic why it is important to do discovery, is that the number one reason why startups fail is lack of product market fit. That means that without the discovery, the discovery is the reason, is the way to get to product market fit. So let's look at it this way. If you look at innovation, which all of you have an idea or you have a startup, and you try to put it on a quadrant like this. And you think of it in terms of technologies, whether it's new or existing, and you look at it in terms of market, whether it is existing or new, you could look at it this way. Let's start with this one at the bottom, because that's the easiest one, incremental innovation. Think of this as, so this is something that, an innovation that happens with an existing technology in an existing market. By existing technology, what I mean is, it's something people know. So if you take the example of the razor, the very first razors did not look like this, but they were still razors. And so they were used a certain way to perform a certain task, and they were a different technology, but the new technologies in razor technology are still razors, right? People can grasp what this is. So to that extent, razors and even the improvement in razors are still the same thing. They're incremental innovation. They're not totally new technology in a totally new market. They're addressing something known in a known market. Then let's go to disruptive technologies. Uber is a perfect example of this. We all know what Uber replaced. We all know what taxis are. So the market is an existing market. What we didn't know is this new way of interacting with this particular service that we used to seek. And that's where Uber brought in a very new idea. Uber didn't necessarily invent the apps or the app concept, but what they did is they brought a very new model, and in that sense, it's a new technology in an existing market. Now, architectural innovation is this idea of an existing technology, so again, something known, in a new market. And one good example of that kind of stuff is microcredits. Think of microcredits. This is bringing banking, a known solution, to a new market, people that didn't have access to it. And then the last quadrant here, new technologies and new markets. And this one is the Amazon Echo that we all know as Alexa. Alexa is totally new, right? New technology and new market, something that just didn't exist before. And those are kind of breakthroughs. They're totally different. Now here's my question to you. How many of you have an idea or a startup that fit with an incremental innovation here? Nobody. How about disruptive innovation? I have some people. How about architectural innovation? Some people. And how about radical innovation? Also some people. Now, for those of you who might not have been looking around the room, what we're looking at is nobody was in incremental innovation. That's usually what established companies do, right? They launch with a new thing, they become successful, and then they improve their product. And that's not what startups do. Startups tend to be in those three other pockets. Now, what that does, and the reason I'm bringing this up in terms of discovery, is because when you're in those pockets, you run into this, which is that the newer you become, the more you run into, are people going to understand my technology and understand why this is relevant? And on the market side, are people going to see a need for whatever it is I'm creating? And the newer you are and the more radical you are, the more you're going to have to do some legwork to figure out and to really figure out whether you have market fit, whether people are going to go for this thing, right? Okay, so that's what we're looking at generally for looking at innovation in terms of big picture technologies and market. Now let's drill down a tiny little bit, and we get into frameworks and tools. Okay, so some of you might be startups, some of you might just start with an idea. A bunch of questions you're probably asking yourself, this is just an example, I'm sure you have lots more questions, is who's going to buy my thing? How will I reach my customers? Is the market ripe for me? How can I legally make this happen? There's rules around it. How do I convince my possible distributors to distribute my thing that I'm doing? And there's a lot more, obviously, and all of them All of those kinds of questions can be answered through this thing that we'll call discovery, which is what we're looking at today. So drilling down, imagine there's you in the center. This is the first tool, I guess. Some of you might already be using this tool. Some of you might not. You might find it useful. I like this tool because it's a very visual way of putting you and what you're building and everything around you and trying to map it out to figure out who you need to plug in to and how. So imagine you're in the center and what you're building is in the center. You will often have people that can influence whether you're going to succeed or whether you're going to fail. And those people have lots of faces. They can be your direct customers. Those are the first ones we think about. Are they going to buy my whatever I'm building? But there's a lot of other people. There's the people that influence those customers, the influencers. There's your competitors. Everybody always has a competitor somewhere or someone that can get at pieces of what we do. Distributors, if you're not distributing your product directly. Regulators, if you're in an area or a industry that has heavy regulation, they can be very important, et cetera, et cetera. And to give you context, if we take just random examples, imagine this is something you can relate to, right? Everybody puts their trash out once a week. And imagine if you brought in an innovation inside this ecosystem, you would have not just to deal with people that bring out their garbage can, let's say you have a better garbage can, but you might have to deal with, can the garbage company pick it up? And the garbage company has a truck that they get from a truck manufacturer. Is it, going to be able to pick up that trash can, et cetera, et cetera. So every time you bring in an innovation, whatever it is, that innovation's fitting within this bigger concept or this bigger ecosystem, and that's where I find this kind of mapping really useful to try to figure out where you fit. Here's another example, one that's more technology-oriented. If you're looking at ultrasound imaging, you have a whole bunch of people that are intervening in that space. Okay? And each of you probably have your own ecosystem that you have mapped out. Some of you probably fully, some of you probably not fully. And this is like a useful tool. So where are we mapping this ecosystem? That's because those people that we're seeing there, we're seeing big categories of people. But ultimately, when you're going to sell, you don't say to patients or ultrasound technicians. You actually go and sell to people. So those big categories of people that we see in our ecosystem, if you're thinking of discovery, you're actually drilling down to this unit that's called the person. And each person, we all know each other, we're all quirky, we're all weird, we all have our own things. And so sometimes you think that your customers might care about something, but they're going to care about a lot of other things too. And the idea of discovery is to really understand people as a whole in their globality, to really understand whether you fit with them or not and how you fit with them. Because statistically, if whatever you're solving as a problem with whatever you're building is not in the top 3 things that people most care about, you're going to be a nice to have, and they're going to be like, it's cool, but I'm going to focus on the really big problems I have. So ultimately, if you think about all these people we just mapped out and what they are in your own industry, you're not selling to companies, you're selling to people in companies. You're not selling to industries, you're selling to people in certain industries. And you're not selling to the government, or you're not interacting with the government, but with people inside the government. Now, there's different kinds of ventures out there. And so we had people that simply have an idea. When you just have an idea, the world is your oyster. You need to start mapping everything. You need to start mapping your ecosystem map, and you need to start figuring out what problem you might be solving with this idea to validate it. That's one type of thing. Now, some of you might be coming from industry, and so you're starting with an identified problem that you know you're trying to address. That's usually the easiest kind of startup to start because you were in industry, you've experienced that problem, so you kind of understand your customers already, and you probably have already some contacts that you know, that you've talked to, and so that helps you figuring out that market fit. And then there's a third kind of people that's probably in this room, and it's people that started with a technology. And that is challenging because you have a technology and you see a huge potential for this technology, but what you don't know is whether you have a person to use that technology and where you're going to use it. So if you want to look at it in terms of discovery, essentially discovery, it allows you to do one thing, if I need to summarize it in one word, is it allows you to de-risk what it is that you're doing, building your business. And it allows you to de-risk it by doing two things. One, doing a treasure hunt to figure out the key people, if that's what the challenge is, because you have a gigantic ecosystem that you're dealing with. Or two, it allows you to understand those people to figure out how you build your product or service to really fit them. So they actually say, I want to go for this thing. So that's really what we're looking at today. And all the tools we're looking at are aiming at figuring out that fit. And really what I'm giving you is just tools that I use that I find super useful. You might or might not find them useful. And again, that all depends on what technology you're dealing with. Because I know, for instance, life science companies, sometimes what the difficulty is especially pharmaceuticals, to take an example. I believe my colleagues that are in pharmaceuticals, the difficulty is finding the right person that's the key person, because there's this gigantic ecosystem, and you have key people that are key decision makers. And that's one of the key things that you have to address through discovery. Not so much will people want something that cures a gigantic, awful disease. That's pretty obvious. But it's finding the right people to be able to distribute it, right? So that really depends on the industry that you're in, and that varies a lot by industry. So here is the first tool that I like using, which is just a way to map what you find. So we said discovery is about understanding people, which means the very first thing to do when you do discovery is to go talk to people. On the right-hand side here, you have understanding the people. The left-hand side of this canvas, that is, by the way, in this book, that I know is at the UW libraries, if any of you is looking for it, by the way, if you find this useful. On the left-hand side here, you have how your product relates to those people. So let's start with people. Everybody has stuff they're trying to get done, jobs. They have stuff that's in their way to getting things done, and they have things that they may be looking for. To give you context of what that looks like, let's take an example. Let's say you have this new project, and this is this new thing you're trying to launch. You're trying to figure out whether a local farm-to-table food delivery service is a thing that's going to work. Okay? You start going and talking to people. Let's assume you're in the idea phase, so you don't have a technology yet. You're in the idea phase. You go talk to people. You're there, and you start just interviewing random people. They might tell you stuff like, I need to eat, obviously. I want my family to eat healthy. I want to raise my kids to take care of their bodies. Those are things they want to get done in their family. That's just a hypothetical. They might tell you, I don't have time to cook. I don't like to cook. And you might decide that's kind of the general thing I hear from people that I interview. And they might tell you, amongst the gains or the outcomes that I would be looking for that would, trigger me to get that solution that you're developing, that I want something that's environmentally friendly, or I care about impressing my friends, and I want to do fancy dishes, but I don't like to cook, and I don't know how to do that anyways. And I get more quality time with my kids. There's a wide spectrum here of various things. Some of them are purely functional needs. I need to eat. That's very obvious. That's functional. And then some of those are more things I like or dislike. They're emotional needs. Or I want to spend quality time with my kids. That's more the emotional space. And some of those are more social things. Like, I can impress my friends with fancy dishes. That's clearly a social gain. So it's not really a like or dislike. This is yet a different aspect of it. So let's say you take this person. You have a lot of different things. This is your archetype person. You've talked to a bunch of people, and this is kind of what you have. From there, you can go back to there and start developing your product. Now, some of you might start from a technology, so you have to do it in the reverse. You have your technology that does all these things, and you need to figure out whether that maps against a person and who that person is that exists. So this map is not one way, right? That all depends on who you are and where you're starting from with your particular startup and where you're at in that. Okay, so yeah, I work for the university, and I'm telling you this. I know this is really bad. I'm going to get in trouble. So I was trying to find a way for, how would I remember this of, how do I need to approach discovery? If I go and talk to a person, how do I talk to that person, and what are the things I need to think about? So here you go. So what do I mean by LSD? Learning mindset. One of the things that we want to do when we have something we're excited about and we all want to do this, is be like, look at this cool program I'm creating. Look at this thing. Do you want it? And the thing is, when you do that, you create bias. So that doesn't work. So unless you're ready to actually test a product and you already have an established relationship with somebody and you're just there to have their feedback on a product, which is later stage, and some of you might be there, you don't want to do that. You actually want to be more back and just understanding them, really being like the example we just saw, which is, yeah, I need to eat, that's a thing that I care about. I like to eat healthy, and that's one of my things that I will put more money into if I can, kind of thing. So it really is about learning mindset, which is asking questions instead of pitching, seeking to understand instead of convincing. That's where you start. And then being accepting of any answer, even though sometimes they're not good. Even a not good answer is actually a good answer. It just means you pivot, you adapt, you do something slightly different. The second thing is strategy. And by strategy, I mean having data. And if some of you are scientists in the room, well, it's basically about that. It's about gathering actual data you can measure that tells you, yes, I'm in the right path, or no, I'm in the wrong path. Because one of the things that we actually can do sometimes is we hear something, it's negative, and we're like, oops, I need to pivot, and then you pivot too much, or you pivot like way over there, and you pivot on 5 different criteria, and actually you might have needed to pivot on just one. And so strategy, again, that's a high-level concept, but the idea is that whatever you do, you need to be deliberate about this. When you go to somebody, you have a hypothesis that you need to confirm or infirm, and you can measure whether you were successful or not on that particular strategy, and that's the idea. And again, if you decide you need to pivot because you hear lots of negative feedback on things, it's about pivoting on certain measurable criteria, and you see if that's working or not. And I'll have resources for you to go deeper in and think about what are those data points that you can measure. There's actually a really good book that I found that I go to for that kind of stuff. And the last thing is about discipline. Now that changes, that kind of covers a bunch of different things. The idea is if you're in this ecosystem that has 3 million people and you need to figure out who's the key person to talk to, that's about following the breadcrumbs to the right person. And that can be, to make it very concrete, as simple as when you talk to somebody, you ask them, who should I talk to next? And would you introduce me, kind of thing. So to just follow the breadcrumbs to the right person. Discipline also has to do with when you go and talk to people and you try to figure out market fit, you will always get things all over the place. It's the same when you work with mentors. Everybody has their own ideas of things, and ultimately, and this is where this is challenging when we want to do entrepreneurship, is that you kind of have to stay true to what you believe sometimes, which is hearing the input and taking it into consideration. But if you think that there is a way to go, you're going to have to make a choice on the way to go. Whether you think that there is a way to go or whether this is a choice that you need to make because you're hearing black and white from the same people or from different people in the same position. And the other part of discipline has to do with B2B versus B2C. And that has to do with a lot of different things. One is personality. If you're an introvert, you would rather do surveys than talk to people. Well, sometimes it's good to get out of the comfort zone and really go and talk to people. I'm an introvert, actually. So I know this is never easy, but it's super important to actually spend some time to talk to some people, I have found, no matter what. But then if you're in the B2C model, you can't talk to 300 million and 85 people. So that's where it's about strategizing, right, and balancing, how many people you talk to versus how much you survey. What I have found in surveys is that you find this is great to get broad strokes, ideas about where people go. It's a lot more complicated to go granular into, what sort of feature might be a good feature, or, things like that on building stuff. All right, so that's LSD. Now, how about building skills? Just getting concrete, and those are just a few thoughts that I had. There's a bunch of different ways that we might want to build skills. One of the good skills to have is to question. Now, question is a very broad concept, again, and you can question to do different things. You can question people to just get answers on what matters to them. You can ask questions to understand surprising or discouraging answers. You can ask questions to find alternatives. So you have a definite data point. This is not right. You can ask questions to actually ideate. And you can ask questions to do something like define a good pivot. Again, that's about ideation there. So that's why questioning is very important. And questioning not people, but questioning also assumptions. Is because what startups might run into, because we saw all this quadrant, right? Nobody is in the incremental innovation space when you're in a startup. You're in the other ones. You might run into answers like this, which is you ask somebody something and they're giving you an answer, but you know that's not what they need, or ultimately that's not what they would need. One thing that Toyota actually came up with is to just ask why. And so this is this 5 why tool. I don't know if some of you are familiar with this 5 why tool. This is just the idea of asking why to go deeper into somebody's motivations when you have something that's surprising or something that you think is too much to the surface when you're trying to understand somebody or their motivations. You keep asking why. And to show you how that can go, I have a very, very silly example. Somebody is the owner of a business. They're your friend. And they tell you I need liability insurance because one of my employees got injured. So far, so good. That makes sense, right? And you ask, you're trying to figure out how you could help them, what they actually need, so you ask why. Why did your employee get injured? Because they got their thumb caught in the conveyor belt. Not cool. Why did that happen? Because my employee was chasing his bag. Now that sounds weird, all of a sudden. Okay, why was he chasing his bag? Because his bag was on the conveyor belt. Now that sounds like the employee was just either reckless or really strange. Why would you put your bag on the conveyor belt? Why? Because you use the conveyor belt as a table. Now all of a sudden, again, you're thinking there's something really wrong there. This is not right. And you go there, and then you have your actual answer, which is there's actually no place to put personal items. So from this thought of, I need liability insurance, if you go deeper, and again, this is a very silly example, but if you go deeper, you can sometimes realize that people have deeper motivations and have things behind that you didn't see. So asking why is something I do all the time. And sometimes it gets me somewhere, and sometimes it doesn't. Some of the other ways to get people to really tell you what's behind the scenes is that are questions that I ask a lot is, let's say you're king of the world and you can change anything, what would your solution look like to your particular problem? And then that gets them talking and you actually get a lot of gold nuggets from that kind of stuff. So there's a whole bunch of little questions like this that are cool to ask. Now, getting into ideation. You have asked a bunch of people for their feedback on what it is you're building, and you're getting some negative feedback. You have to find an alternative. You're in ideation. There are good questions you can ask to go in ideation. It's going to sound very obvious to you guys, and maybe that's something you already do. But those are things that I do. I ask questions that impose constraint, that add constraints to your landscape. Let's say it becomes forbidden for us tomorrow to sell to any of our current customers. How do we make money? It's absurd, right? It's never going to happen, but it forces you to think outside the box for alternatives, and sometimes it helps your brains just ideate and create more. Another one, what if we could only reach people through digital technologies? What would you do? What would that look like? And that can also help you figure out things. So it's about imposing constraints. Good questions also do the opposite. They eliminate constraints. This is something startups never have. But what if you had all the money in the world? How would you get this done? How would you approach this? What if you could get it done in half the time? How would you approach this? Lots of options. Those are questions. Those are other little exercises. This is an idea, like a website, just one random website that I've picked from. There's a lot of things out there to just like help you ideate if you're looking for tools to ideate. And by the way, you will all be able to get the slides if you want. So you'll have all of that. And one that I particularly like is the 6 hats, because in Western culture, we tend to argue against each other, and we tend to play the devil's advocate. So when somebody has a good idea, everybody looks at what will not work about it and shut it down. And that actually shuts down ideation. So when you want to ideate, the idea of the hats is kind of a cool idea. And the hats, what they do is they make you all see in the same direction. So for instance, the black hat is actually the hat of the devil's advocate. So you put your black hat on and then everybody destroys that idea. Why will this not work? And then you change the hat and you say, now let's do yellow hat, and you force yourself to only think about the positive sides of this idea, et cetera, et cetera. And it's a silly tool in a way, but it's a tool that's like super, super helpful. And when you're, if you're meeting with your team and people are all going in all directions and try to shutting down ideas, that just disciplines everybody to just make it data-centric, essentially. To be like, okay, what can we put together that is positive, what is negative? The white hats is the facts, what are the facts we're missing to actually evaluate this idea, et cetera, et cetera. And so it allows you to be systematic, which is cool. Okay, now another thing, you're a little farther, some of you are probably a little farther in creating what it is you're creating. And so you're in the testing phase. And you're either testing to, see the features that would be good features in what you're building, or you're testing to just gather feedback in general from an idea. No matter what it is you're testing or at what level you're testing, at the beginning or later in stage, there's a bunch of things that are kind of cool in testing your ideas. There's a lot of different kinds of prototypes. Testing means prototypes often. And it goes everywhere from you have a fully functional product and you're really testing, final testing stage with your customer of, is this working for you? Like, what do you need different kind of thing? All the way back to an idea. And actually, if you're at the idea stage, one of the things that I do and that I know one of my colleagues did with his company all the time is to do paper-thin prototypes or something that costs nothing. So I'll call them paper-thin prototypes. And they look like this. And the idea is to just essentially go back to kindergarten and just make your thing just enough to give people an idea of what it is you're building. And when you have no money, that's actually a cool way to build something with no money and still get people to understand what it is you have in your mind and getting feedback on things, and a good way to do discovery. All right, and again, testing stage, it's again about learning. It's not so much about selling. And it doesn't mean that marketing is not important. I'm not saying to the marketers, like, don't market stuff. But I have found that going organically about stuff and just asking people for feedback is a very often, at least in my industry, has been a very natural way of getting people interested in what you do and involved with what you do, and converting them into customers, actually, rather than saying, hey, look at the cool thing that I build, or that I'm building, and trying to sell them on things. It might not work in every industry. You guys might have different answers on that one. But yeah, the idea is really to learn rather than to sell. Discovery, the idea behind discovery is you're learning, because discovering product market fit means you don't know what people need. You're trying to see what they need or see if your assumptions are correct about what they need. So it's not about showing your product. And again, doing all of these things that we just talked about is something you're going to need to do with a lot of different people in your ecosystem, depending what your ecosystem looks like, because there's your direct customers that you're selling to, but you might have somebody distribute your product, so you need that person to be in sync with you, to have a reason to distribute your product or promote it on their platform or something like that. If you can find that sync, it's powerful. You will need influencers to promote you organically, because that works really well, et cetera, et cetera. And for each of those people, you're going to need, in a way, a value proposition. How do I click with those? How do I become that person that they want to work with, because I'm solving one of their problems? And sometimes it's an easy thing to do, to solve one of their problems, but sometimes it's not. So that's where discovery comes into play for a lot of different people. And this is also something you're going to need to do for every aspect of your product and your business model, right? Is the price right? The price is a very difficult one to put together. Are the marketing channels right? If you get this one wrong, hey, you might have the greatest product, but you'll never get to your customers, or they'll never go through you because it's the wrong channel. Key features, et cetera, et cetera. And as for cool places to go and find a bunch of information around discovery that I go to, talking to humans is great when you're looking for gold nuggets of the kinds of questions that you want to ask, or how to go about this kind of discovery when you need to really step back and not talk about your product, but really ask questions. This is really good at giving you a frame of mind and key questions that you can go for. And the innovators method is more of it's a really cool study It's by academics, but they went into the data that's behind like the science of pivoting. It goes into the data of what's behind the science of ideating, and it takes you through all of the stages of building a venture from an idea all the way to something that functions and that takes off. So I like it a lot. And then for those of you who might be the radical innovators in the room, there's always the one added question of, is this no, not yet, what's going on there? Is the market right for this? And this is something that probably comes into play a lot when you come from a university system, because primary research means that you're way far ahead of where the market is. So you have this really, really cool thing, but sometimes people have no clue because the market takes like 5 years or 10 years to catch up. They're not there yet. And so this is a really good testimonial over this kind of idea of, is this no, or this is not yet and I need to persevere? At which point do I need to stop? And I found that very helpful. And that's it. Do you have any questions?
I'm going to have to use this one for the Q&A. So this is for you.
So that's for me.
Okay, it's on now.
Okay, sounds good. Oh, here.
Hi. My question is, where do you find these customer base to ask questions? I guess it depends on your product and services, but your base can be really wide. So how do you go in and say, okay, this is my customer base that we'll start with? How do you find that base?
So this one I'm going to have to answer by looking at the startups that have gone through us rather than my personal experience, because my personal experience, every time I kind of knew what my customer was. I think the way that it's been happening is you have to start with one that you think is the most likely. It's your hypothesis, and you go talk to those people, a few of them, or a fair number of them, until you have confidence that this is a go or a no-go, a good market or a not good market. And then you get to the next one. That's kind of how they do it. The idea is don't go through like 50 different options right away. Go a little deeper in one to really prod. I don't know if that answers your question. And I don't know were you looking at like, how do you define like in general from up there, what market you would go for rather than the people, or?
Did you go to a third party and that do this kind of survey and say, hey, I want this type of survey for this. You define your customer or your base, and then they help you with grabbing someone, and then do you do I guess is, I understand you saying, well, start at one, and then broaden it. Okay, okay.
Well, that depends if you, yeah.
If you have thousands of dollars to pay for market research study,
That was going to be my answer.
I don't need.
That was going to be my answer.
But yes, like it's awesome if you could pay one of those companies to help, validate the market for you. Otherwise, yeah, it is just one-off.
Yeah, it's better
Attempt and do market research.
Yeah, if you're going to pay a company, you're going to want to know in broad strokes at least where you want them to go, because otherwise it's going to be very expensive.
Can I disagree with that?
Sure.
Sure. I would love a lot of money and hire everybody to do all the things for me, but I would say don't have anyone do it for you, because it's the most valuable thing you can do as a small company is talk to your customer and learn whatever you can learn from them. It's everything, so that's what I would go for.
That's cool. I like that.
Like I'm in about a 3-year-old startup, and we didn't know where to start. So we created some surveys and just went downtown and stood at bus stops, and people were like waiting for their bus to go home at the end of the workday. And it took like some screener surveys and then some follow-up surveys to get the right questions. And then, for example, we were coming out with a mobile text app, and we found out through the surveys that our best target market was like people over 60. And we found it through the surveys.
I think it essentially depends on which segment you are targeting, whether it's B2B or B2C, first of all. Once you have that clarity, you want to see which channels are the right channel you want to engage with them. So if it's a B2C, probably you can start with your friends and family to take their inputs if they use that services already. And literally depends on what stage you are in. Probably if you are trying to raise funds for a seed investment, I think a good enough sample base which helped you identify the product market fit would be helpful. If you are going for B2B space and let's say in pharmaceuticals, and you are literally launching something in radical innovation side, solving some major disease, I think in that case you might want to engage with a more professional firm to have the analysis. But depends on which segment and who are your audience and how big is that.
Hi there. So my question is, you talked a lot about gathering data, a lot of it through surveys, but I've also heard surveys sometimes have their issues and limitations. So if you're doing something like a panel or interviews like that, how do you make it worthwhile for the people that you're interviewing? If I can't pay them specifically, like how do I make it like worth their time to give me the time of day?
If you're there to learn, actually, and you ask them for advice, kind of like a mentoring relationship, I find that a lot of people go for that. You're asking for just feedback. Also, are you part of UW? Yeah. Then you have that really, really nice card of, I'm part of UW, I'm a student, and I'm doing research. And that opens a lot of doors, actually. I have found I've never had too much trouble. It's all about getting out there and really, daring kind of to ask people. Most of the time, they do spend some time. Now, don't spend too much time. You want to just spend a few minutes, and they're busy people, so you don't want to spend too much time. But if you spend a little bit of time and you build this relationship and you ask, can I come back and let you know how this is going and get your feedback, they're generally interested often too, especially if this is a click at the first stage of, I might be interested in this, then keep them posted. They might become a customer actually over time by just helping you build this thing with them.
Yeah, so I think, first of all, thanks for the discovery approaches and especially the learning mindset, strategy, and discipline point of view. My queries specifically with respect to the time period as well as the quantifiable milestones with respect to product market fit discovery. So if we are talking about, let's say, B2B business, what is the ideal timeline you see in typical? I know it's a vague because it depends on industry and which innovation you are doing, but especially in case of new architectural innovations, what's the ideal timeline do you see? Definitely your top line revenue is one thing you can see by that, or how long you can survive, but is there a timeline which you see, or identifying product market fit is an always on exercise for startups?
To me, that's a constant thing. That's something you always do. So you do a lot at the beginning, but then you keep going. As long as you're building your thing, you keep going and keeping in touch inside. At least that's been my approach. Again, happy to crowdsource this one because my approach is just one approach in one industry. I don't know if any of you guys have had different approaches, but that's been my approach. Is I do a lot at the beginning to figure out and validate just the hypothesis, and then I keep going and I keep checking in all the time.
Is there any particular metric apart from, and if there's one metric which we are optimizing for, what would that be according to you, especially for B2B segment?
What do you mean by metric?
So let's say initially, for a B2C business, it could be just to getting people to sign up to use your service or trying out your food or whatever venture you have started, versus for a B2B where, let's say, you are evangelizing an email service or an AI chatbot product, which has its own sales cycle and it's a custom deployment. What do you think, like in terms of, because what I've seen is perseverance at the end of the day allows you to be successful, and you eventually figure out your product market fit. But in terms of a framework, is there apart from the initial steps which we put across for identifying product market fit on the journey? Because I literally ended up writing a post on how to know when it's time to quit your startup, because I figured out all the signs when you know that it's time to quit versus when you figure out that maybe it deserves one more extra leg or there's a timeline which you need to follow.
Well, if I look at what the data shows, is apparently you're supposed to look for this increase, and again, this is a hypothesis you need to set in advance, is how much of an increase in the base do I need to get to for this to be a takeoff, what they call a takeoff in it. And that apparently varies by industry, and I think that depends on what metric you're looking at when you're doing this. But that means looking at others in the field and what that looks like for them, and defining this percentage of increase, or this, whatever this metric that you're doing, how that needs to go up to be a good sign. And yeah, and that depends on the market around you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, just to play it back, so basically having thresholds across your product market fit journey as well as your startup journey, and sort of using them as measures across the journey as you move
Yep.
ahead. Thanks.
Any other questions?
Hi, Margalie. It might be fun to go back to your risk technology versus risk market.
Yes, happy to do
Because
that.
I gotta go back a ways. Sorry about that.
I'm gonna get there, I'm almost there. This one.
Yeah, I love this, right? It's a great way for people to understand. And I think we could go a deeper dive into that and say, as a startup company, it's really important to know where you are on that. But one of the questions you want to ask is, do your customers think the same? Because that's not always the case. You
Well-
might think you're the radical innovation, but actually you're more,
Well,
you
that,
know,
you're correct on this one, and that's why I asked the room how you perceive yourself, and I think you can perceive yourself in different ways on this one. There is actually a very good, and you can find that just on Google. There's this external one, the technology uncertainty versus demand uncertainty, has been mapped out by industry, depending what industry you fit in. Now, those are for industries that exist currently. So if you're in an industry that you're building, essentially, it might not be on that map. But it is put there by industry. And unsurprisingly, gold mining is at the very bottom of any kind of, risk. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have all the technologies that are being disrupted that are at various places in there. And then I remember seeing the hotel, like hospitality industry, for instance. It's never the technology that's the problem, it's the demand uncertainty, so it's higher right there, things like that. And so you have it by industry, and depending what industry you're in, it's a cool map to look at if you just want it as a framework to know where you're standing in theory from, the statistical standpoint, from the data standpoint. And it's out of the Harvard Business Review, this particular map. Happy to send it to you guys too, if there's people interested.
So my question now is, if you're kind of building a product, or you're building some sort of either platform, device, kind of anything, and then you are kind of able to make a prototype pretty quickly, so you're able to get data from that too. Does that fall into product market fit, where you say, try this out, what do you think, or is that kind of a different field?
That's the testing phase.
Okay.
And yes, it is creating product market fit. It's actually all of this thing that I just talked about is all based on this idea that has several names in engineering. It's called design thinking, I believe. Or no, that's the designers that call it design thinking. Human-centered design is more the engineering approach, but it's essentially the same idea of having steps, and then you repeat your loop until you're at the point where you're right. So all of this, asking people questions and testing, is something you need to go back and forth on. So you gather enough data, you test something or some features, you test, you get your feedback, you go back to iteration and to, creating your thing, to asking questions, et cetera, until you have something where you feel like you're good and you can go ahead. And the feeling that you can go ahead always has to, quantifying, setting a hypothesis of how much positive feedback do I need before I feel confident in my particular industry, and whether I'm B2B or B2C is going to be very different, that I can go ahead and launch, and that this is going to be de-risked, or de-risked enough that I'm confident.
Thank you.
So I know you spoke a bit about targeting specific people during when you build a new product and you want to test it for validity, how does your approach change when your target is not, say, a specific person, but it is a whole organization within a specific industrial sector? So how does your approach in terms of getting that base for validating?
Are you thinking a particular organization in the sense that this is this organization that you would like as becoming your customer? Is it in that sense?
Right.
Well, so what's interesting with that is, yes, you want to sell to a particular organization, but inside your organization, you have lots of people, right? You have the CEO, and below the CEO, you have everybody else that goes into various departments. And if I think of any organization, the people that purchase for the organization are not necessarily people that end up using the thing, that are not necessarily the people that, end up developing the things that go with that thing you're selling to them, et cetera, et cetera. See what I mean? So, for instance, something that's used by a patient in a hospital might be prescribed by a doctor, and the doctor doesn't necessarily, or might be used by a doctor for the benefit of the patient, and it is bought by somebody else in the hospital that then gives it to the doctor that then uses it on the patient. See what I mean? And so you can go way back. And if you're actually on the patient side, its insurances are going to have a say in things. So whenever you're looking for a particular organization, you're actually looking at key people in a particular place in your organization that are going to be decision makers or influencers that can help you promote your thing inside the organization. So yes, your customer is the organization, but your customer is really a few key people inside your organization that can be your users, that can be your influencers, that can be your purchasers. And you need to figure out who they are, and then you spend more time with the people that are the ones that are important. Does that make sense?
So how do you narrow down your list then for those whole bunch of them?
And that's where following the breadcrumbs is a good one, where you meet a person and you think this person is kind of a good fit, you ask who's the next person to meet, until you really find that you're at the person that is the decision maker for your product. And then that's the person you want to spend time with. And sometimes it takes a long time. I know, again, my colleagues that are in the pharmaceutical industry, it takes years to build those relationships and to know. And once you know people and your next startup, it's faster. But the first time, it's like you know people, but like you're a scientist and you know all the people in science and you're trying to figure out who the people in business are, who can make the business decisions and building those relationships. No other questions? Yes, there's one in back. Katie.
So I'm following the design thinking process, and I'm at the point where I'm putting my prototype in front of my customers. And I'm wondering whether you have any tips for kind of approaching those conversations, given that you want to be objective and you want to kind of reduce your own emotional attachment to the product. And like, how do you kind of, and also they probably feel a little bit sensitive about giving you feedback, like making them feel comfortable about giving you critical feedback. And do you have any tips for that?
So I have a question for you. Are you going to people that you've already built a relationship with?
So I have a few people that I worked with on the original customer discovery part of the interview process, and then I have new people as well.
Okay, so the new people I'm assuming are the ones that are slightly more sensitive. Well, the way that I've done it is essentially really start a conversation by I'm not selling you anything. I'm just curious to see what you think of this thing. And really not going on a you're going to be my customer kind of thing. You're just going to be a mentor or somebody who gives me feedback, and thank you so much for giving me some of your time. And just, dump on me. Give me everything that you think. The good, the bad, the things you love, the things you hate, the things that are kind of in between. And then from that you gather data. Again, like really not going in selling mode at all, and really starting the conversation by putting that out of the way kind of thing.
Do you
And
give
then some
them a
people
lot of...
might have other...
It's almost impossible for the developer or the inventor to ask a non-leading question.
Yeah.
And so like the best thing you can do is go over to the HCD school and recruit an intern, like a UX researcher, because they're looking for internships big time right now for the summer. And you would easily find people who want to run UX tests for you.
That's a great
Cool
recommendation.
tip. Thanks, Mike. That's awesome.